This is the state webinar that is on the centrality of protection and protection of civilians. My name is Ingrid McDonald, and I am a director with the Senior Transformative Agenda Implementation Team, otherwise known as the state. I'd like to, before we move to our distinguished panel for today's discussion on the protection of civilians, just to go over a few of the ground rules. This webinar will be for 60 minutes. The first 30 minutes will be focused on questions that I will be putting forward to the speakers, our panelists today. And then we will open up to you as the audience to put forward your questions. As much as possible, we try to make these webinars interactive and take your various issues and put them forward to our panelists. So I really encourage you to use the chat box, which you will, if you look at your right-hand corner, you will see that there is a chat box there. We have people here who will also engage in that chat box with you. And you also can put questions directly to the team here at the state, which then we can put forward to the speakers. So please do, I encourage you to put forward those questions. We're very interested to hear from you today. Please note that this webinar is live streamed on YouTube. If you have a poor internet connection or audio problems are coming through, please do go to YouTube and you can click on one of the buttons there, and that should be able to help with those audio issues. Now for today's webinar, we also have an opening poll. So if you also have a look on the right-hand side, there is a poll at the moment. It really helps us if you can fill in the questions that we have there so that we can make these webinars, which we do every month, to be as focused and as useful as possible for you. So I do encourage you, you have 20 minutes to fill in that poll. At the end of the webinar, we will also have another poll, our closing poll, so it would also be helpful if you could look at that. So let's turn now to the actual webinar itself. Today we are very, very lucky to have the Deputy SRSG and Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq, Liz Grande, on this webinar with us. Liz has a distinguished career. She has worked for well over 25 years in the humanitarian field in a variety of leadership positions. While she's currently in Iraq, she's led the operations in India, in South Sudan, in places like Angola, all over the world. She has been on our webinars before, and she's also been part of some of our field engagements through the operational peer reviews and state work that we have done. So we're very privileged to have her today and really looking forward to her discussion. We also have Dennis Adras, who is the co-coordinator of the Protection Cluster in Iraq and the Protection Working Group in the Kurdistan region. Dennis has worked in the region for many years. He's taken on the role of protection in a variety of different capacities within the International Rescue Committee as well as a variety of other organizations. He is the co-cluster coordinator at the moment in Iraq with UNHCR, and has been leading a lot of really inspirational work that we will discuss in terms of the framework there. So we're very privileged to have both of them on this webinar. Now, a lot of what we'll be talking about today is based on a mission that we recently conducted to Iraq in August. That mission was conducted with the Global Protection Cluster representative, a representative from World Vision, and from a Lebanese organization called Amal. We enjoyed the hospitality of the Humanitarian Coordinator, as well as the amazing office of OCHA, which looked after us. It was an excellent mission where we had the privilege of really listening to the practical, concrete examples that in this incredibly difficult situation that the humanitarian workers are facing in Iraq, they are able to take forward really inspirational work. And so today we want to look at the practical steps that the senior humanitarian leadership in these field operations are taking to strengthen the centrality of protection with a focus on the protection of civilians. This is inspired by our discussions with the humanitarian coordinator, the humanitarian country team representatives, OCHA, UNHCR, the various protection cluster coordinators, the international and the national NGOs. They're all facing huge challenges, particularly with the upcoming Mosul operation. But what is also really evident from being there is the real focus of the operation on trying to have as much proximity to the people as possible, to try and apply a principled approach and really put protection at the heart of what they are doing. And I think that this is if this can be done in one of the largest, most difficult, most complex operations in the world, then this is something that could be hopefully taken and applied more broadly. So today we have 150 participants. Most of you are in the field across 45 different countries. So you can all will have excellent experience that you can bring forward. So I very much look forward to those questions coming through. And I'd now like to move over to Liz. Liz, thank you very much for joining us. You are one of the inspirational leaders in terms of the area of protection of civilians. You've put it front and center within the Iraq operation in terms of the humanitarian response plan, in terms of the sector plans and driving that forward, which is highly appreciated by many of the protection actors and others there. I mean, Syria is complex, it's very difficult, the human rights and the protection violations are quite brutal, and there's many, many different stakeholders there. Some of those stakeholders are more open to talking to humanitarians than others, and it's a very complicated situation. So it would be really interesting to hear from what steps you believe that humanitarian leaders, including humanitarian coordinators like yourself, and representatives on humanitarian country teams can take to strengthen respect for the protection of civilians, of the population, including by these different groups. What do you think can be done by HCTs? What can be done by humanitarians practically to make this happen?
Ingrid, thank you, and we're very pleased to be part of this important webinar. Dennis, it's great that you're the other panelist and can bring in the views from the protection cluster. Ingrid, in responding to your first set of questions, I hope that you'll allow me to speak a little bit about two situations we're facing right now. Well, one we're facing now and one we just recently faced. In just a few days, the military campaign to retake Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq and one which has been under the control of ISIL since June of 2014. That military campaign begins. In a worst-case scenario, as many as 1.5 million civilians are likely to be impacted by the fighting. In a worst-case scenario, as many as 1 million of those civilians might be forced to flee from their homes seeking safety. If a worst-case scenario, in fact, happens, we would expect that the humanitarian operation, in fact, would be the largest, most complex single humanitarian operation in the world in 2016. Given the extreme grave risk that we think civilians will be under, we've been working very closely with the security forces that will be involved in the operation to ensure that they do absolutely everything possible to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and ensure that civilians are protected and that they're able to receive the assistance they deserve. And the reason that we're stressing international humanitarian law is that in Iraq, this aspect of protection work is really the center of what I do as the humanitarian coordinator. It's to work with all of the parties to the conflict. In Iraq, there are more than 100 parties to the conflict. The coalition to degrade and defeat ISIL includes 66 different member countries. There are numerous security forces that are involved in the campaign, and there are also popular mobilization forces or militia that are involved. You add all of them up, and there are 100 parties to the conflict. And a key aspect of our engagement, in fact, the central aspect, has been insisting with all of the parties that they uphold IHL. We see this as the bedrock of everything we're trying to do to protect civilians. So let me talk a little bit, if you allow, first of all, about what happened in Fallujah, because this was an operation where there were a lot of stumbles at the beginning of the operation, and as we continued our engagement with the security forces and the parties to the conflict, by the end of the military campaign, I think all of us felt that very important steps had been taken by the parties to the conflict to, in fact, ensure that civilians survived. I'll just briefly sketch out what happened. Fallujah was a stronghold of ISIL. It was the attack to retake the town started in June of this year. At the time the operation began, there were 100,000 civilians which were inside the city. We were very worried that there could be literally tens of thousands of civilian casualties. We also were very worried that ISIL would in fact take tens of thousands of civilians as human shields. The second happened. The first really did not, and that's what we would like to talk about. So, to sketch out what went on in Fallujah, the beginning of the operation saw a significant number of families try and leave the city. The Army had been working with us on identifying what they called humanitarian corridors or escape routes, and they had identified them. They dropped leaflets that told families where these corridors were. ISIL, having found out where the corridors were, in fact killed civilians that tried to use them. So that was an effort that was undertaken before the operation began, that when the operation started, it was clear that that was not the way to go. What also happened at the beginning was that thousands of families tried to leave the city, and when they did, they ran into checkpoints that were being manned by militia. And there are documented cases of hundreds of men who were screened at these sites and subjected to serious human rights abuses. It was clear within the first week that those checkpoints needed to be moved so that civilians were not at risk. And through engagement with the security forces, with the civilian leadership of the country, a number of member states of the UN leaned very heavily in, and in fact the checkpoints were moved. And as a result of that effort, many civilians were able to reach safety, not having to go through checkpoints where they would have been at extreme risk. What also happened at the same time was that our protection partners used a variety of social media outlets and all kinds of communication networks to get the message back into Fallujah to families about where the checkpoints were so that they could literally run the other way. So there was an effort to move the militia, which was successful, and at the same time we were reaching out to families to say, these are the places that are safe for you to run. Within just a few days, a second major protection crisis emerged, and it was one I referred to earlier, where we had been afraid that there were human shields, and in fact, we were given to understand that as many as 40,000 civilians were being held as shields. Our key point at that stage was to make sure that the authorities knew this to be the case and that they took steps not to imperil the lives of those civilians. 2 weeks into the operation, the Prime Minister himself went on national television and announced that the military attacks would be slowed so that civilians would be protected. In other words, the direct attacks straight into the places where the human shields were being held were held. We know that as a result of this, literally tens of thousands of people whose lives might have been in peril were safe. There were also techniques used by the military to break the human shields and liberate those populations. They were successful. And there was a very dramatic period in the Fallujah operation where within a span of 2.5 days, 36,000 civilians, they'd all been shields, were able to make it to safety. You know, that experience of in real time, in the so-called fog of war, that the UN was working day in, day out with parties to the conflict to solve two problems. You know, the issue of the checkpoints and the human shields, I think is an example of the way that in Iraq, in the midst of the war itself, of the actual battles, we are actively, determinedly engaging with the parties so that everything is done to make sure that civilians survive, that they live, and they are able to reach safety and receive the assistance that they are entitled to. Ingrid, before I hand over, maybe I can say a few words about the Mosul operation. And I mentioned that it is likely to start very soon. We expect it within the next week to week and a half. I also reflected on the fact that if it is a worst-case scenario, it will be one of the largest humanitarian single crises in the world this year, if not for a number of years. Knowing this, we have been, for the past 2.5 months, working with the parties to the conflict, again, to engage with them on the steps they will take to uphold international humanitarian law. The Iraqi security forces have confirmed that they are doing the following. To begin with, they are alerting the civilians of the upcoming campaign. They have developed escape routes, and they are preparing what they call safety cards. These are the cards that civilians will be using to show that they have safe passage. They are doing what they call white flagging neighborhoods. This means that they are advising populations that in the neighborhoods that they can protect, civilians should remain in their homes if they feel safe, that the Army will do everything they can to protect people in the homes. If the fighting reaches a stage where the Army feels it cannot protect civilians in their homes, then the Army will signal to them where the escape routes are, and the families will be directed to take those. The Army is also developing tactical strategies to liberate human shields, much as was done in Fallujah. They have confirmed that the militia will not be involved in any stage of the Mosul operation, nor will they be involved in the screening. And again, based on the Fallujah example that I just shared, you can see why this is so important. The Army is also, they have developed a humanitarian concept of operations at every stage in the CONOP. There are the steps, they specify them clearly, that they will be taking to uphold IHL. I think that just to close on our reflections, what we felt was so important in working in an area where civilians are at extreme risk from IED contamination, from artillery, from crossfire, from the war itself, that we couldn't sidestep IHL. We couldn't just mention it. You know, many of us do. We are, as the international humanitarian community, in many ways the great champions of IHL. But what we thought we had to do in Iraq was to work, you know, determinedly with the parties to the conflict so that they did what was necessary to make sure that civilians survived. Ingrid, those are some of our opening reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I think that you've really brought this, the reality of the field to us and to the listeners on this webinar. I think that what you did is you've also really put at the heart and center is the importance in terms of international humanitarian law as a framework, the importance of your role and leaders' role in terms of engaging with the parties to the conflict and taking forward the really critical, sometimes very difficult areas of the evacuation routes, the screening sites, and the learnings that happened in terms of Fallujah, and then applying them to the Mosul operation, which just sounds huge and incredibly complicated. So I think that we will come back to those important points and unpack them. But now I would like to go to Dennis first. I mean, Dennis, you've heard everything that the humanitarian coordinator has put forward in terms of the role that leadership plays with the representation, the advocacy, putting in place the various frameworks with the parties to the conflict. Now, you've also been focused on working on a framework, but this has been much more in terms of what the humanitarian actors themselves are doing or not doing. And this comes out of the issue of dilemmas. In every single operation, not just in terms of Iraq, but in other operations as well, the humanitarian community is often faced with this issue of protection dilemmas or operational dilemmas, where if they do an action, it could be that they need to provide aid, for example, in these screening centres, but if they do provide aid and there are the violations, as we've just heard, these documented violations towards men and boys that are ongoing, does the humanitarian community then become complicit in that? Or how do we avoid that? How do we uphold the IHL and the human rights standards at the same time as our humanitarian principles? And this is very common, and this happens in terms of places like the Central African Republic, it happens in Syria at the moment, it happens in Afghanistan, it happens in many places where there's armed conflict. What's interesting is that in Iraq, you're trying to develop a very practical framework that will assist operational actors on the ground when they're faced with these real-time, difficult dilemmas in terms of what actions they should take in practice. And so this is one of the most operational frameworks that I've seen and that we've seen across the work that we've been doing across the various countries. And so I think it would be great if you could unpack some of that for us. And also the role of senior leadership to support. How does senior leadership support on putting in place these types of frameworks, and how have they supported you, and how this is the centre in terms of the centrality of protection. It would also be interesting if you could put forward in terms of the role of yourself as a protection cluster coordinator, how you support leadership and how you support in terms of this protection framework. Over to you, Dennis.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. So in terms of the tool, let me first step back a little bit and note how it came about. It's important to clarify that the framework is not solely or even primarily a protection cluster document. Instead, our colleagues within the Shelter NFI cluster developed the original matrix with the idea of providing very practical guidance to partners with respect to their interventions at critical sites. For this reason, the framework relates not only to protection concerns, but also to other practical considerations, such as the types of NFIs that are best distributed at a transit center to people who are on the move. That said, of course, protection is a core element of the framework. From the protection perspective, it's important to note, as Lee said, that Iraq is a protection crisis, and that one that presents a number of dilemmas. Nearly every screening center is unique with its own policies and procedures and protection concerns, depending upon the region in which it's placed and the armed groups in control. The context is such that, more often than not, partners are hesitant to intervene in some locations absent consultation and clear advice when it comes to protection. So within a fast-paced and multidimensional protection crisis, the lack of clarity about how to operationalize protection guidance has strong repercussions for the nature and scope of the humanitarian response. It's fair to say that within the UNBAR context, for instance, the scope and nature of the response was hampered in some ways by a lack of clarity in terms of how to operationalize the guidance the cluster put forth prior to the commencement of the operations. So this is something that we're keenly aware of. Also, the other clusters are aware of and desperately trying to fix. So I say all of this because I want to emphasize that the framework is not about placing limits on the humanitarian response, which is a common misunderstanding. Instead, the framework responds to the need for clarity about the types of interventions that each cluster, including protection, recommends when protection and humanitarian concerns are present. In short, by providing clarity, along with our counterparts in other clusters, we hope to enable a more robust and principled response going forward. Further, I think it's important to highlight that the framework provides a tool for having concrete discussions within the context of the ICCG and HCT about the nature and scope of our response efforts. In this respect, it serves as a tool for encouraging consistency, as well as transparency and accountability, all of which are points that we can come back to, if you like. In terms of the components of the framework, on the slide you will see an illustration which elaborates on some of the primary elements or components. Also, there's a link on the page to the document in full, the concept note, which includes a much more thorough description of the document than I can provide here. As you'll see, the framework includes 4 color-coded categories related to the severity of the protection and humanitarian concerns at issue. For now, I'll only say a quick word on the red category. Namely, it reflects a basis for conversation, which I think is important to underscore. In practice, partners should not hesitate to provide truly life-saving assistance, absent the most extraordinary circumstances. So the category primarily exists, and the reason for why we've kept it is to ensure that if aid is not being provided, a conversation as to why takes place. I'd like to note as well that there are general criteria that relate to each of these color-coded categories, which can be found in the document, via the link. So just a note in terms of the overall framework, as you can see as well, it includes 5 locations: checkpoints, screening facilities, transit sites, other non-camp settings, and camps. So the result is, in the end, each cluster will populate or complete a matrix of this sort such that there's a hierarchy of interventions for each of these key sites, depending upon, again, the nature and severity of the humanitarian concerns at issue. So if we're talking about checkpoints, there'll be clear interventions for Shelter 95, for instance, about what types of steps should be prioritized, both within a green scenario, orange, yellow, and orange. So maybe I'll move on now to the development of the framework. Just to note, really, that the current framework reflects extensive conversations with other clusters to come to an agreement mainly upon the primary components that are illustrated here: the number of color-coded categories, the locations, etc. At the HCT level, in addition to fostering consensus and buy-in, the focus has been developing the criteria that relate to each of the color-coded categories. Again, those criteria can be found within the document that's linked, but it's just important to underscore that the criteria that relate to each color-coded category have very serious strategic and policy-level considerations, which is why we've really been focusing on developing those in consultation with HCT members. In terms of application, there are 2 ways, at least, of thinking about how the framework is actually put to use. So once it's been fully developed and populated by the clusters. First, this is a tool that individual agencies and frontline staff will possess. To a large extent, it provides a great deal of clarity, or will provide a great deal of clarity, about the types of interventions that each cluster recommends within each key location. So as I've mentioned with checkpoints, for instance, there will be a list of specific interventions that each cluster recommends to their partners. Second, in some cases, it will be helpful for the ICCG and or HCT to come to a decision about the categorization of a specific site. And this relates more to some of the chronic scenarios that we face with regard to some specific sites that have been in existence for some time. So following a preliminary discussion, the ICCG clusters can communicate the categorization of the site immediately to partners, who of course can use the framework itself to translate that decision into specific interventions. Here, ideally, the protection cluster will prompt the conversation by providing the outcomes of a rapid protection assessment. We typically conduct these assessments at the onset of a new emergency or following a change in circumstances, and often succeed in issuing the first report within 72 hours. So that is to say that there's an element of timeliness here, and we have a tool, this rapid protection assessment, that responds to that. and can facilitate conversations both within the ICCG and HCT. It's important to note that the assessment provides, generally speaking, a common basis of understanding for those conversations to take place, as well as an evidence base, so that when it comes to documenting these decisions and ensuring transparency, we have the reasons for the decisions in writing as well. In the event that the ICCG first considers the issue, of course, it could then be forwarded on to the HCT for endorsement or revision as the HCT deems appropriate. In terms of next steps, we've discussed the document once within the context of the HCT and followed up considerably with HCT members on a bilateral basis. So we're at the stage now where more or less there's general agreement on the components of the framework. So we'll again be taking the document to the HCT for formal endorsement. Following this, each of the clusters will work with their partners, whether it's their strategic advisory groups or their partnership base more broadly, to really think through, again, for instance, when it comes to checkpoints in a situation that warrants only limited first-line responses, what does that mean for each cluster at the level, again, of very specific interventions? So the shelter and FI model, for instance, actually lists, shading and different types of NFI kits that relate to each circumstance. Once the matrix has been agreed upon, populated, and endorsed by the ICCG and HCT, I think as a final step, it would be really valuable if individual agencies were willing to adopt or sign on to the framework as an initiative of sorts to kind of foster a broader degree of accountability and understanding. So moving on, I can briefly address the second and third elements of the question. Namely, I'll step back to provide a few quick words on how the framework relates to the centrality of protection. In large part, it does so by reinforcing the unique roles and responsibilities of the protection cluster, the ICCG, and the HCT. For the cluster, it's a concrete mechanism for putting protection guidance into practice on an ongoing basis, as I've more or less just described. For the ICCG, it reflects a framework for providing nuanced yet concrete guidance to partners, a type of guidance that reflects the operational realities, which, as Lise mentioned, are heavily nuanced in the Iraq context. For the HCT, importantly, it reinforces the role of the HCT as the primary forum for strategic and policy-level decision-making. It also reflects a tool for ensuring that, when appropriate, the position of the humanitarian community is both deliberate and consistent. Finally, it recognizes that the nature and scope of the humanitarian response ultimately carries heavy political implications. In terms of why it is important to have the support of senior leadership, as we do in Iraq, this is because only senior leadership has the mandate and the authority to ensure the centrality of protection through strategic and policy-level decision-making, of course, and high-level planning and advocacy with military and government, as Lise is fully described. In response to the final part of the question regarding how the cluster supports the HCT, I would also note that the cluster often has the opportunity to brief the HCT on key protection concerns and to put forward recommendations. I believe, as Lise mentioned, protection reflects a standing item on the HCT agenda. So every meeting, we put forward a brief that highlights what we see to be the 3 to 5 most critical protection concerns, often during a 2-week period, and do our best to offer concrete recommendations to the HCT about how to address those issues. Additionally, we frequently appear in the HCT to provide ad hoc briefs on a number of topics, whether they're reflect thematic issues or site-specific issues. So that's been a common basis of engagement. So I think I'll leave it there, Ingrid, and turn it back over to you. I am, of course, happy to answer any questions about the framework or about other topics that I've raised.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I mean, I think that what you did is you provided a very detailed insight into the framework. I mean, just to recap, what I think some key takeout points from it is that essentially the framework isn't about as sometimes it's perceived. Often it's called these red line type things, and people get worried that it's about stopping operations. What you're saying and what you're using this framework for in Iraq is really this is a way to facilitate the operations as much as possible, to think about these dilemmas beforehand, to help frontline operational workers to be able to deal with these challenges that they will face, and to guide them so that they're not put in a situation which means that they aren't able to move forward. So that's very admirable. Also, in terms of I thought what was interesting is the different types of interventions. It's not just about, as we often see in some of these other types of matrices, where all humanitarian assistance is lumped into one category. You're actually working across the clusters to recognize that some humanitarian assistance or protection interventions have higher thresholds than, say, for others. For example, the medical intervention in terms of the responsibility there. So this very operational focus in terms of the protection of civilians really matches very well with the humanitarian coordinator's discussion in terms of the role that she uses and the leaders use in terms of their engagement with the parties to the conflict. So I'd like to go back now to you, Liz, in terms of, one of the questions we've received really it focuses on, you brought up international humanitarian law, you brought up the frameworks around that, and I think it's really interesting that you do that, because there is this perception sometimes that protection is just too sensitive, too complicated, or too difficult. And that sometimes leadership is reluctant or to take up the key protection issues or to take forward international humanitarian law frameworks because of these concerns around sensitivities and the complications. What do you think can be done to address this perception? First, you agree with it. How can it be tackled better by leadership? What steps need to really be put in place, and what would you recommend from your vast experience? Liz?
I think, Ingrid, that now, we have to face the fact that we're living in a world, very unfortunately, where one of the bedrock principles of civilized behavior, international humanitarian law, is at jeopardy and under threat just about everywhere. And I think that one of the few communities that is in a position to really uphold this and ensure that everybody respects it are humanitarians. So whether it's a sensitive issue or not, I think it's compelling. We have to do this. There's no question that in places where there is active warfare and civilians are at extreme risk from that humanitarians have to be the ones that engage with the parties to the conflict and keep reminding them that they've got to make sure that people live and that they get access to the assistance that they are entitled to under international law. Now, that's not meant as a way to sidestep the very real fact that these are, oh boy, really, really difficult things to do. I think that how do we get humanitarian leadership to do it? We make it absolutely clear in their terms of reference that it's mandatory. They have to. I think that member states from the United Nations who are committed to IHL and who care about it have to be partners with the humanitarian coordinator in making sure the parties do what they're supposed to do. I think that humanitarian coordinators have to be given the room to do this within the UN's bureaucracy by our key partners, by our NGO partners, by our donors. Those are the factors that really have to be in place before an HC, I think, can effectively take the agenda in the direction it needs to go. We've been very fortunate in the case of Iraq that there are leading members of the United Nations member states who believe in this and support us. We have an exceptionally led protection cluster. We have a dedicated group of frontline NGOs who deeply care and are actively engaged on protection issues. So we're fortunate that there are a constellation of factors that have allowed us to put this at the center of everything we do. I think, if I can be very open and frank, that one of the reasons that humanitarian leadership is often reluctant to do this, there are kind of two main ones. One, we often don't know how to do it. And two, we're often the stalking horse, have the HC go and raise these issues and, let her do it on her own and nobody support her. And, humanitarian coordinators, I think, would be very prudent if they found themselves in that situation. In, as I said, the case of Iraq, we're lucky. Member states care. NGO partners are on the front lines insisting that we do this work. And the protection cluster has created an environment that allows us to openly discuss it, reflect on it, and to get the job done.
Thank you, Liz. I think your open and frank perspectives are incredibly valuable for us, and I think that highlighting the really important role of leadership having the tools to be able to do the job, but also having a conducive environment with the humanitarian team at all levels around them this is absolutely fundamental for you being able to take forward and your other leaders around you being able to take forward these issues. So thank you. I mean, I think I'd like to move now to Dennis. I mean, Dennis, we've also received a question. I mean, one of the things about this operational framework, it looks very, very interesting. It's very detailed. As we know, with these types of guidance or frameworks, there can be skepticism about their ability to be applied at the field level. That sometimes they can be too heavy, sometimes they're not user-friendly. Is it realistic that frontline humanitarian workers, where they're in the heat of an operation, will actually use this framework? And how are you going to go about, or how are the clusters or the agencies that are involved in this, how are they going to go about ensuring that this is applied when it's needed most?
All right, thank you. That's a very good question. So I think the first element of my response would be to say that the momentum behind this initiative has been gigantic. Cluster coordinators really across the board have been heavily, not just supportive, but doing the best they can to push this thing forward. And the reason for that is that it, as I've mentioned, it gives very specific guidance to from the clusters, but to frontline staff. So really even down to the level of specific interventions at different sites. That being said, certainly I think there's a great deal of need for training on the tool, for the clusters themselves to engage heavily with their partners and ensuring that there's a common understanding, in part through involving them in the development or population of the matrix itself. So this is actually something that Shelter-in-a-Fire has done, although with the prior version of the matrix, and it's something they will redo. But they sat down with their strategic advisory group and went through each of these locations and had a very open discussion about what types of interventions are you offering, are you willing to offer, do you think we should offer under each of these circumstances. So I think that very participatory process of developing a framework is absolutely important. It has its costs because the Mosul operation on the horizon, we don't have much time to really get this thing in place. But nevertheless, I think that step is very important. So just to sum up, I think there's been a lot of encouragement from the clusters themselves. The process is one that will entail a lot of direct involvement of partners in developing the framework. And then, of course, on the tail end, we recognize the need for there to be ongoing training, support to the clusters, et cetera. I guess then finally, in terms of how do we ensure this is applied in the long term, I think protection has a critical role to play there. We often already raise issues about specific sites within the context of the ICCG or HCT, about protection concerns, about various dynamics. The problem to date has been that we don't have a clear mechanism for translating this very kind of general and, to be frank, on some level, theoretical guidance into practice. And so that's really what clusters have been asking for, and partners, and really what we're hoping to provide.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That was really, really helpful. Liz, a question that's come up is, while IHL is a very useful framework, you've also highlighted yourself the fact that IHL it's under risk at the moment, and this has been something where a lot of concern was put forward in terms of the World Humanitarian Summit, in terms of other areas. The whole issue of upholding IHL, there is this general feeling that it's under attack to a certain extent. So I would be interested to hear your perception on, there is still a lot of ongoing violations that are occurring, and in a situation like Iraq, there's constant, all the time, violations in terms of IHL, violations in terms of human rights. The criticism is, why do we keep on trying to use these frameworks even though we see the conduct of hostilities is being undertaken in such a brutal manner? So is it fair to say that it is making a difference in terms of IHL? And if you could actually give a very practical example about how you have seen this happen. For example, you talked about evacuation routes, you talked about screening sites, where you have been able to practically use that framework to really make a difference, it would be excellent. And also in terms of then how it's not just in terms of the very bad armed actors, but also the government armed actors and others who are engaged in this conflict, and what practically you've done to do that. Over to you, Liz.
IHL is necessary and it's compelling, and it's not something that we should shy away from or step away from. It's under attack, and it requires all of us as humanitarians to defend it and to get the parties to the conflict to uphold it. I think really it's one of those foundational aspects of our work. Just because it's hard, just because it's under attack, no excuse, no alibi for us to step away from it. In terms of where we concretely saw that, internally, when we were looking at Fallujah before it happened, we were worried that there could be as many as 20,000 civilian casualties. And in the end, 100,000 people made it to safety. There were hundreds, as I was very open about, hundreds of young men who were subjected to abuses at the screening sites, and we need to be very, very frank and upfront about that. If you look, though, at the engagement on IHL and what was actually done, those routes, the tactical strategies to liberate the human shields, all of that work resulted in a scenario where 100,000 people made it out with their lives. There's no question, I think, for any of us that are doing the day-to-day engagement, and a lot of the IHL work with the security forces is done by our CivMil teams. Now, these are very highly trained colleagues who are working with the parties to the conflict directly, the military parties, and getting them to talk about this and develop not only strategic ways of dealing with it, but operational and, most importantly, tactical ways, on the ground in the battle tactically. How do you make sure those escape routes are known? How do you make sure that they're protected? How do you get civilians to them? This is the work that we do day in and day out. And as I said, I think it's difficult to prove a counterfactual, but anyone who followed the Fallujah operation knew that the steps that were being taken were decisive in saving tens of thousands of lives. This is why everyone working on the Fallujah humanitarian concept of operations, or CONOPS, has put the protection aspects right at the very top for the same reason. There are a lot of civilians that are at extreme risk, and it's incumbent on all of us to do whatever we can to make sure that they survive.
Thank you. I think emphasizing the role of SIMCORD and the importance that SIMCORD has actually played, the civil military support that you have there, is quite critical. And on this note, I'd also like to acknowledge that we actually have a team of 25 from on this call at the moment. Joseph with the SIMCORDs is doing a training, and he's brought his team to listen to this webinar, so welcome to all of them. And I think they are very interested in this discussion. Just over to you, Dennis. Dennis, on the issue, you discussed the issue of the humanitarian country team, you discussed the issue of the protection cluster. Could you explain how you see the difference in terms of the roles and responsibilities of your role as a protection cluster coordinator with that of the leadership? This often comes up a lot in terms of missions. It comes up a lot as a question. Sometimes we hear that, well, there's no need for the humanitarian country teams to take up protection because that's really the job of the protection cluster. What is your response to that, and what do you see in terms of the difference of those roles and responsibilities?
Great, thank you, Ingrid. So, starting with the protection cluster, it's certainly our role to provide technical guidance and recommendations as it relates to issues of protection and human rights. I think your question highlights an important concern that, in order for the centrality of protection to be meaningful, it's an issue that needs to be taken up with senior leadership. The people who are in the position of making strategic and policy level decisions, and of course, interacting with government and military leaders to bring about the types of changes that Lisa's highlighted. So that really is to say that I think we all have various roles in this process. Certainly the protection cluster is in some respects an important actor in terms of highlighting issues, providing data, analysis, and even putting forward recommendations. But ultimately it's the senior leadership, members of the HCT, that are in the position of carrying forward those recommendations. They have the responsibility and the mandate to do so. So I think that's the basis of the distinction.
And in terms of, for you, Liz, I mean, as the humanitarian coordinator, you're the person who brings together the different parts of the humanitarian system within the humanitarian country team under your chairmanship. What do you see in terms of the responsibilities of the humanitarian country team on the centrality of protection, and how have you sought to put that in place? I mean, you've talked about the protection of civilians, the civil military dimension, but in terms of the broader protection issues, what is it that you do, and how do you work with the humanitarian country team to ensure that leadership is taking up those responsibilities for protection and putting protection at the center of the response?
A couple of key things that we do. Dennis already referred to the fact that at every single HCT we have a dedicated section that we call a protection brief. So what happens during that is the protection cluster, through the lead agency, through UNHCR, tables a map that shows in the past week where the major protection issues have developed. They also produce a very elegant narrative or description of each of those protection problems with the recommendations for the HCT to consider. So that's done every single meeting. When there are punctual problems, for example, if provincial authorities are looking to evict IDPs and send them back into dangerous conditions, then we would, through the HCT, understand which member of the team deals with that punctually. When there are issues of a long-standing nature or a structural nature, then the key for the HCT is to recognize that there has to be not just a punctual intervention to solve a specific problem, but a broad strategy to deal with an embedded problem, a deep problem. So the HCT would then ask in those situations the relevant part of the humanitarian community to deal with it. Very often that is the protection cluster. So we have widespread forced returns. Well, I wouldn't say, I mean, definitely we have continuing examples of this, and we have reached out to what's called the Returns Working Group and to the Protection Cluster and said, please guide the HCT on what all the different kinds of steps, what we need to do at multiple different levels and in multiple different ways to address this problem. So we work both on punctually solving specific issues and then developing integrated complex strategies for dealing with embedded or structural problems. So that's key for the HCT to make that distinction and to take that on. The other thing that's important, I think, in the HCT is, in addition to talking about protection every single week, is to being very open with how would we describe this, with the advantages that the members of the team bring. So in our HCT, we do have member states. So there are donors who are member states. I don't want to shy away from this point. Some of these same member states are parties to the conflict. Okay, so they are members of the coalition. They have, as member states of the UN, disproportionate sway with some of the parties to the conflict. Well, we exercise that. We ask these member states to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law to get the parties to the conflict to do what should be done. Many of our NGO partners have some of the best advocacy networks in the world. And we ask them to activate those networks, and if there are specific sets of problems or structural problems that require high-level exposure. We will often ask some of the lead humanitarian agencies if they can, for example, use their media expertise to get the issues to the forefront of the agenda, both nationally and internationally. So we're very active about recognizing that sitting on the HCT are a range of partners that have exceptional assets and capabilities that can be brought to bear to deal with protection problems, whether they're punctual problems or structural problems. And we're really active about exercising those.
Great. I think those are some very, very practical steps that can be put in place, and in terms of how you're bringing this together. I'd just like to say to those of you who are listening, we do have a final poll that's been up. You will have seen it come up in your right-hand corner. If you could please fill in that poll, it's very, very helpful for us for when we plan and how we take forward future webinars. Just one final question actually for you, Liz. As you move forward with Mosul, you've highlighted, I mean, this is a really extreme situation. It's huge what you and the humanitarian actors and the civilian population are facing in Iraq. What do you think can be done? What sort of support do you think is needed, and what can be done to from outside Iraq to support you and to support the humanitarian community at this time as you move forward to ensure that protection is at the center of the response and to ensure that these important issues that we've been discussing today will be taken up?
You know, you can't really be effective on the ground if you don't have money and you don't have capacities. So the first point is, for humanitarians to influence the course of what's going to happen, we have to be funded. And if we're not funded, we can't do it. Secondly, there has to be sufficient capacity on the ground. You know, if you have 1 or 2 people working on these issues, well, not a lot gets done. If you have 50 or 100 people working on these issues, a whole lot more gets done. So, you know, we got to be frank about that. This operation needs to be funded. It's not. And it needs to have a lot of capacity and the right level capacity. And it doesn't really. So these are 2 very critical things. And the other critical things are talk about it, and then talk about it some more. Talk about it to the media, talk about it to parliamentarians, talk about it to decision makers, talk about it to all the parties to the conflict. You know, keep talking about it and talk about it some more, and exercise our voice on behalf of the civilians who are going to be at extreme risk in Mosul. I mean, those are three obvious things. We do it in all of our operations, and in the case of Mosul, we got to do it here as well.
Thank you very much. I think that it's been excellent that you've been talking about it today with us. I think that there's been some fantastic insights that you provided, and you've also demonstrated that it's not mission impossible in terms of the protecting civilians in these armed conflict situations. Dennis, thank you for your insights. Just for everyone who's on the call, we will be putting forward information on our website, deliveraidbetter.org. There will also, you can also access the webinar recordings on the YouTube channel that we have, and there's a variety of other means. Please do fill in that poll. We will be coming back to have another one of these webinars later this afternoon. I hope that you will join us for that, or your colleagues will join us for that, and we will hear further insights from the Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq and also the Co-Protection Cluster Coordinator. Thank you very much, and we will be sending out this information later in the month. Goodbye.